Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our series on Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history. Or is it that?
World history.
World history, that's right.
It's close enough.
So many fields to keep track of.
Yeah, so this is our third or fourth video on India now.
Thereabouts.
Yeah, and we've reached civil legislation. So this is where Hegel sort of talks about how people interact with each other, how people interact with laws and with the arm of the state. And this is clearly important for Hegel because he writes in the introduction, abstract freedom, existence as a person is the foundation for all ethical freedom, right? So
He does indeed. And then later on goes to say that the political condition is based in the family. So Hegel, come on, which one is it? Family or abstract right? Make up your mind.
good, yeah, good. So because you pointed out abstract right. The first thing that he talks about is property,
Yeah.
right? And that's one of the first things he talks about in the philosophy of right as well, right? Once we get into the book proper.
Yes. As soon as people have a right to rights, the first right they want is right to have things, to have stuff.
Lovely. I love stuff. So
Which is a key part that needs to be tackled, right? It's pretty mundane and taken for granted, but it's super essential if you think about it. Like, where would we be without property?
so it's the kind of recognition. Is it recognition by the state, an insurance of the state, a guaranteeing of by the state that what is understood to be yours is rightfully yours and not just contingently yours?
I guess there are two perspectives one might take to that. One is kind of like the front-facing perspective or the back-facing perspective. By which I mean, like, if you're starting from the beginning of the philosophy, right, you're following along the logical order, which begins with the will and then develops into the free will that wills the free will, and that develops into rights, and then rights becomes particularized into particular, determined rights such as property. But there is no mention of any state at this point, or ethical community, or what have you, right? It's just the logic of right unfolding. So I'm calling this like the front-facing development that takes into account the logical order of things, and from there, I would say it's part of the logic of right that these things must be so, right? That it unfolds in this way imminently. But then you can have the back-facing perspective, which is that, well, rights and properties and all these things, they don't exist in the abstract, even though that's how they appear in the logical order. They eventually turn out to be moments of morality, state, history, right? And that has its own logic. And so from the back-facing perspective, that's like the more true one, because that's where we get the more concrete version, the results, and we see that, and we see that the actual foundation of right and abstract right and so on is in the historical situation and in the state and what actually happens, right? But there's like two different prongs of perspective one can take. So I would say yes and no, as is the usual Hegelian answer.
Right. Okay. Okay then. And so to bring it back to what we're reading here in the lectures on world history, Hegel seems to be critiquing the notion of, or the conception of, land ownership, of property rights in India, because one, it seems to be a rather convoluted system of understanding who owns the property.
Yeah, ambiguity.
Yeah, there's ambiguity. And two, it looks as if the farmers who are working the land don't properly own the property, that there's a sort of a shared ownership almost with the state.
Yeah.
So there's this interesting paragraph, the third paragraph of page 265, where Hegel talks about how the people at the time thought that the system of property originated. And it says, it is evident that in the most ancient times, the Raja or prince was originally the sovereign owner of all the land, although the farmers had a hereditary and continuing right that was an ownership too, with the result that there were two ownership rights: the rent that must be paid to the prince, and what remained to the farmer above and beyond this rent.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess Hegel thinks you can't, a state that properly recognizes your right to property can't conceptualize this right as being two ownership rights over the same thing.
Well, I don't know, because modern day China has, I think, a similar thing going on where corporations and various entities can buy land of the state, but they don't actually buy it forever. They buy a lease that lasts for like, I don't know, 30, 40 or 100 years. And then the contract, it becomes renegotiated at the end of the time or something like that. So for all practicalities, they have bought it, they own it, but really, like fully, sovereign conceptually, it still belongs to the state.
Yeah, you've got the same thing in many parts of London as well, where land is still owned by aristocratic families, and individuals will buy leases to the land.
And looking at this in terms from the viewpoint of the state, it makes sense that you, as an individual or as a corporation, you can buy plots of land and so on, but you as an individual corporations really cannot enforce that right. It's really the state that has the kind of violence and power to enforce various rights. So even though legally you might own certain things, it seems like in practice the real owner is always going to be the state, because they are the ones who can enforce things.
Well, that's problematic though, isn't it? Because your individual property rights aren't being recognized. It seems, from the little that I understand from the philosophy of right and Hegel's philosophy as a whole, it seems to be that it's significant that the individual property rights have their moment.
Yes.
And that they're not merely a moment of the state.
Yes. And I think that a rational state understands that it must recognize individual properties for its own benefit. Right. Otherwise, it just becomes incoherent, right? It turns into a kind of despotism, which defeats the purpose of having a state, which is supposedly something coherent and rational, right? But if it just devolves into people taking shit away from others, then what's the point of the state?
Right. Yeah. So this brings us back to what we spoke about, I think, in the previous episode, where Hegel understands the Indian state to be fundamentally a despotic state or a tyrannical state. Does he use them interchangeably, or does he prefer one or the other? I can't remember. Maybe despotic was the one he focused on.
Yeah.
But yeah. Should we move on to the second point?
Just to quickly, one more thing on this point, and that is that it seems like everything is much more diffused in India, that there isn't a kind of strong formal superstructure. It's more that every village, every community has its own thing going on, and it's very tightly integrated with itself, and it excludes other communities, or that it deals with them on its own terms, and that there isn't a kind of neat superstructure, which explains why the British had such difficulty comprehending what was going on, because you basically had to be down on the ground to get a good sense of things.
Do you think Hegel, because I remember in the first discussion in India, where we talked about it as the land of fantasy, and we sort of focused on the multifarious particularities of it. Do you think this is Hegel is trying to draw some kind of parallel here, that in the way that communities are organized, there's sort of organized as individual particulars, each sort of standing apart from the other.
Yeah, it seems yes and no, because the whole fantasy element, seems like the one constant in this, right? That's the universal, which everybody shares in, right? Everybody shares in the religion, they share in the caste system. So there is certain things that are really universal, but they don't come together to form a explicit universal organization, such as a state that has a strong formal superstructure. Rather, it's the one that emphasizes the particular individual communities.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So then Hegel goes on to the second point, which is concerns
Testimonies.
testimony in court.
Yes.
Legal testimony. And so again, I think his point here is just generally that there are very few people who can give legal testimony in court. So for example, the king, that's disputed in a footnote, the cook, public dancers, singers, nor reputable persons who have no sons but only daughters, and women can only testify against women.
Basically, a lot of special rules.
Right. A lot of special rules about who can say something that will be taken as truthful or valid in a legal court.
Yeah.
And again, Hegel doesn't really say this in so many words. He doesn't say it in any words, actually. He really just describes this. But you get the impression that his concern here is the arbitrary distinctions between whose testimony is meaningful and whose is not. Again, I don't know what he says about this in the philosophy of right. If he talks about legal testimony? I mean, I know that the courts are an integral part of the state, and the law, the execution of the law, is part of this sort of the universal objective moment of the state. But testimony is quite a particular feature of that.
Yeah, I haven't read that section concerning those things in the philosophy, right? So I can't say. I'm sorry.
What do you think about this section?
Well, I found it really surprising that Hegel states the laws of Manu allows the rendering of a false testimony when doing so can preserve the life of a man who otherwise must die.
Right.
That is super interesting and fascinating. That, yeah, it's okay to lie as long as it preserves a life. It's like, wow, really? This is anti-Kantian to the extreme.
Yeah, and then he goes on to say, right, insofar as the harshness of kings is well known, falsehood is preferable to truth.
Which is, I think, more truthful to the historical situation, but it has a blatant sort of formal contradiction, because it sort of flies in the face of rights to have this kind of system explicitly.
Right.
So there is an incoherence there.
I guess he's also, by pointing out to the harshness of kings, he's pointing to the despotism, right, of the state. And I suppose implicitly he must be thinking, well, this is what happens when you have a despotic state, that you are creating the wrong kinds of incentives for people. By being unjust, you are, or by people knowing that you are unjust or unduly harsh, you are incentivizing them to behave in a way that is itself unjust to escape the magnitude of your punishment. No?
Yeah. I think so. So basically, you're saying that if the foundation is despotic, then that's going to reflect in also the formalization of that despotism.
Right. Yeah. I mean, from a purely sort of psychological point of view, that seems quite obvious, right? I mean, if the person in charge is not playing by the rules of the game, or is not is behaving in, no, the rules of the game is the wrong phrase, because yeah, if the person in charge is playing by a certain kind of rule, or is employing a certain behavior, then you could expect the people that are below them to follow that behavior as well, because
Yeah.
you would just be inflicting more pain on yourself by behaving in a just way, as we would conceive justice.
Yeah. Yeah. So, a nation with a dictator who behaves,
Right.
like
Exactly.
that, inspires that kind of behavior. It sort of
Right.
trickles down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you've got sort of corrupt secret police, you've got brutal other branches of the state behave in a more brutal and despotic manner as well. Yeah, I
Right.
think that's a good example. Yeah.
But then, how can any of this be corruption? Because isn't that just the order of the day?
Yeah, it's not corruption, obviously. Yeah, from our perspective of what is right, it is corruption. But I guess
Well, hang on. I don't think we should just relegate that to something of a certain viewpoint versus vis-a-vis another. I think we can make a universal claim on corruption, such that certain states operating in a objectively corrupt manner are deficient in some way, because they still need to pretend to be just. They cannot just kind of fall back on their despotism and brutality. They still have to keep on the airs of being right and just and so on,
so.
even though they're not, and everybody knows it.
I think this is probably the case with, say, Soviet Russia, where you have a people who have a memory of what it was like to be in a society where these sort of concerns were taken seriously. But when we're talking about ancient India, where the standard is something very similar to what's already there, and there isn't a memory of, oh, there was a time when we had law courts where everyone's testimony was taken seriously.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, obviously Hegel would say it's not just about perspective, it's deficient because it's not the proper idea of the state.
Yeah. No, you're right to point out that we are going off track here, and that within India itself, there isn't an idea of something other than this. So we should really be thinking of, okay, if this is how the world works, if all, it's still preferable, because there is some sort of system, albeit one that's very special, like has a lot of extra special clauses and so on. It still has a kind of echo, or a trying to live up to the idea of right.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so it's a moment of the progression in history.
And it's better
right?
than the state of nature.
Damn. Depends on who we ask. Rousseau or Hobbes.
Good point. Yeah. Okay. Should we go to the third point
then? Yeah. Let's go.
So that concerns debts. Notably, Hegel focuses a lot on the amount of interest that is allowed to be charged on a debt according to your caste distinctions. So the long and the short of it is that if you're higher up in the caste system, you get charged less interest, and if you're lower down, you get charged more interest. And then there are these accepted manners of debt collection, which not too dissimilar to what I've read occurred in medieval England, but a further recourse involves the wife, children, livestock, and clothing of the debtor can be confiscated. Furthermore, it is lawful for the debtor to be compelled forcefully, even by the cudgel. Finally, one may sit at the debtor's doorstep to see whether that moves him to payment. Fantastic. Just sitting there. Just waiting. I'm here. Hi. Still waiting for my money. I'm not going anywhere.
Well, since you mentioned that it was some similar sort of behavior was taking place even in medieval Europe. It's like it goes to show that human beings have had a really awkward relationship with money for longest time. That it's always felt like something unclean and filthy and strange, and like we don't really bother about it, and a source of dishonor, right?
Yeah, that's true. And the fact that exactly, and I think you also get that impression with this distinction in interest rates for different castes. The lower castes pay higher interest rates, as if the dishonor of a person of the lower caste being loaned money is greater.
Yeah.
And the person for the higher caste is like, because they're more virtuous, it's less bad, I would suspect. I don't know exactly what the reasoning is.
Yeah. So just going off a little off topic here, maybe capitalism, modern day capitalism, is kind of more a healthier relationship to debt, in the sense of you don't think of it as debt, you think of it as capital. You think debt becomes capital, basically, right? It's just that if you have access to debt, it means you have access to capital, which you can do stuff with. You can use the debt and make stuff out of it, which isn't something new, right? It's just that the relationship to that has changed in capitalism. So debt has always been a means for capital and to do stuff. It's just that it was always regarded as something of a deficiency.
That's a good point. Does Hegel talk about this at all? To your
I don't know.
knowledge?
I don't know. Not pops into mind.
Yeah.
But like, if you're able to borrow debt, then that's a great thing.
Yeah. Well,
because you can do stuff with it.
Yeah. Well, our whole banking system is based entirely on debt, right?
Yeah.
A bank will take £1 that you make and sort of make it into £10 and give it to another bank, and your £1 becomes something that is loaned for £10, and that will, I presume, will be loaned out to someone else.
Yeah, but it becomes such that your access to debt becomes important, right? You as an individual, maybe you can get a mortgage, maybe not, right? But if you are able to, get a massive loan to build a business or something like that, then that's more value, right? But how do you get that kind of value? Maybe you need to have the right connections, the right skill set, etc., right? So all of this plays into the valuation of debt and its access.
Maybe on this point as well, I don't think Hegel is thinking about this at all, because maybe this is not really in the air in Hegel's time. But just what you're saying about access to debt has made me think about this. The fact that there are certain groups in society in ancient India that have more difficult access to debt means that there is, from a capitalist perspective at least, there is less possibility for them to express their individuality.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you're in the lowest caste, you can't open up your own tea shop. Like, it's harder for you to open up your own tea shop.
Yeah.
Because of the higher interest rates. And so I guess there is something democratizing in having a state bank setting an interest rate that holds for everyone.
Yes.
And sort of everyone has, generally, though it varies obviously according to your credit rating and how much collateral you have, but everyone in general has access to a certain amount of debt at the same sort of interest rate, more or less.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, the difference in interest rate is not dependent on contingent features of your birth.
No, exactly.
On
your birth, which is the caste, right? So
yeah, exactly.
You're just like, you didn't do anything, but you're just worse off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
And then, of course, we need to mention that women have a horrible time.
Right. Yes. Hegel makes a point to this as well.
Yeah.
Is that in the next section? Yeah, when he talks about marriage. Yeah.
Yeah, but just at the end of this section, point 3, he says, as for justice and personal freedom, there is thus no glimmer of it. The female gender is wholly excluded from a right of inheritance and even debarred as such from making a will. When there are no male heirs, the goods go to the Raja.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interestingly, in Sparta, women were allowed to inherit. They were like, the inheritance went to the wife rather than the children.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, which created a kind of female aristocracy, wealthy class of women, female sort of landowners, which is very peculiar, very strange.
Yeah, that is strange.
Given what
Can you
Sparta
imagine
was.
being an Athenian and looking at Spartans behaving this way? How odd that must have looked.
They were
And
just
vice
weird.
versa, how the
Yeah.
Spartans might have thought, how odd these Athenians are.
Yeah, it's like the Spartans were from space, even for the Greeks. But we can maybe discuss that once we get to Greek history.
Okay, so the fourth section then is on marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And so Hegel talks about basically the role of women within within society, and then how that role changes if they get married in a monogamous relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So some examples he gives that women are not allowed to eat in the presence of the husband. It is further the case that wives are more or less purchased by the bridegroom from the parents. And then there are some things about fathers sort of choosing who their daughters marry. I guess all these things are meant to sort of point out the lack of individual freedom.
Yeah, and it's imperative that the father marries away their daughters. Right. It's seen like one of their foremost duties, such that it is preferable to marry your daughter off in a polygamous relationship or even to a monk, even though that monk may have 40 other wives, still it's better, right? Which is kind of like shows really that women are treated as property at this point.
Right, so that seems to be the point, yeah, that women are treated as property. So from this section, we really get the impression that, as you sort of pointed out in the beginning of this episode, that marriage, the family, is a really important point in a state. Hegel is spending a lot of time dissecting the different kinds of disadvantages within a marriage for women. So he writes further down that the beginning of a political condition involves the recognition of marriage and above all monogamy. Interesting point, especially with regard to nowadays as well, where we sort of have the growth of different kinds of relationships. But let's not go down that route.
Let's not yet. Let's.
No. But clearly, this is Hegel. And if we think about sort of the nested circles of the state, the family is sort of the first, the immediate sort of nested circle.
It's like the basic unit.
The basic unit of the state, yeah.
It's an absolute unit.
So Hegel obviously is. This is obviously a big no-no for Hegel. The sort of the degradation of the importance of marriage, of monogamy, and thereby, I suspect, the family.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on this?
So it seems like the things that Hegel is most occupied with here is the practical behaviors surrounding marriage rather than their formal sort of stipulations. So he talks about how when marriage takes place, it's not really so much that the couple sort of moves in together and builds, reside together and so on. It's more like they go back to their individual families, which they were with before, and then the children are kind of just taken care of by the sisters of the brother instead of the wife together.
Yeah.
Seems incredibly odd. I don't know, to the point at which these records are accurate.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say they are, and then that would go to show the strength of the existing community to the point where it sort of chokes out the new community, because that's essentially what a family is. It's a new community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point, bringing it back to what we spoke about earlier with regard to land ownership.
But then this also doesn't make sense, because how does any because the current existing family, where did it come from? Right?
Yeah, what happens when well, I guess, right, the children grow up having been raised by their aunts, and then they get married, and then their children will be raised by their sisters. No?
I suppose. Yeah.
And so on and so forth.
Yeah. Well, shall we proceed to the last point? Yeah. So this one concerns religious practices, which seems like a big part. And based off of the things we have said this episode and last, there is a lot of special rules. And a lot of these rules are kind of like dictating very mundane practices, and some of which seem kind of like pointless, right? So this is definitely a point at which Hegel is very hostile towards in terms of the historical development, the greater historical development. As he writes, for the Hindus, however, all the actions that pertain to daily needs are carried out subject to a host of rules that are themselves quite senseless, rules that makes one's life into a sequence of senseless practices, with the result that the Hindus conduct their lives in a senseless bondage.
Right. Okay. So one could obviously read this as a insensitive comment about society's practices, like cultural practices, right, that they deem to be important. But yes. I guess Hegel's point is that I don't think Hegel is deriding the importance of cultural practices. I think he's concerned that by imbuing too much symbolic significance in the mundane moments of life, that you're overburdening yourself and you're, by overburdening yourself, you're inhibiting yourself. I think there's a very nice so for example, some examples he gives. So upon awakening, one has to recite prayers, to stand up using a specific foot, to clean the teeth with the leaf of a specific plant, to go to the river, taking water into the mouth and spitting it again 3 times, and so forth. I guess Hegel's point is, and I wonder if this connects with the initial point about fantasy and the sort of overextension of subjectivity into the world of objectivity, that by over-imbuing the objective world with significance, that you are but they seem to be connected, but I'm not quite sure what the connecting point is.
Well, to me, on the face of it, it just seems like, well, if everything in your life is predetermined by rituals and rules and so on, the question should be, well, who are you then? There is no you. I mean, it annihilates individuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You are your caste. You are following a specific characterization. You're mostly of who you are is to play a role. And I think Hegel is fine with culture and endowing certain roles upon us. But when that role becomes absolute, then really you are just an empty vessel as an individual. Which that's the kind of a great paradox with overemphasizing subjectivity, is that you end up having no subjectivity.
Yeah. Yeah. He gives this nice story of this prince who marries this princess who was courted by genies.
It's
And
a Nala.
she wisely picks the prince and sort of sets aside the genies, but there's a vengeful genie who's sort of waiting for the prince to make a mistake, to take revenge on him. And the mistake that the now king makes is that he steps on the spot where he had urinated, which is a faux pas.
Mm-hmm.
And now, because he did this, because he violated a sort of a cosmic rule. That's the implication. That's the feeling you get. It's kind of a cosmic violation. That the genie now has power over him. And as the story goes, the prince gambled away fortune in the realm and was ruined on account of this sin. And it's interesting how similar this is. Sorry, a minor interruption. And it's interesting how similar this is with, let's say, Christianity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you can very much see how a Christian's sin might haunt them, but then Christianity has confession.
Yeah.
And it gives you this outlet.
Yeah.
How you can get out of the consequences of your sinful life. Though nevertheless, there are lots of sort of anecdotes, right, of people who die and they died because they did something in Christian Europe, medieval Christian Europe, or they died because they didn't do something, right? So if someone stole a bit of the Eucharist from Mass, instead of eating it there and then, to take it with them for other use, and they died, a very reasonable conclusion that someone might draw at the time is, well, they died because they stole the Eucharist. They took it out of the church and they didn't eat it in the church.
Yeah.
And so this is very similar. It's a kind of superstitious thinking that I think Hegel is criticizing here. And I wonder if Hegel will say something similar about Christian Europe in this regard. But the point I want to make is it seems to be much more absolute, much more definite in the case of ancient India.
Okay.
That there is no going back from one of these cosmic violations. That's it, and your life will be sort of haunted by an evil genie, by something and events that are sort of working to undermine you.
Yeah. I have two perspectives one could take on this. Sort of reflected perspectives, right? So you don't take this story at face value, because if you do, I mean, it's absolutely silly, and similar kind of stories from other traditions. So the first perspective kind of is the question of, well, how, what kind of actual impact does the formal rule that this thing states have on reality? So we have these formal rules, these behaviors, these values, because presumably they serve some sort of real objective function. Don't eat meat on Fridays, seems very symbolic and silly, but maybe practically having a day off from meat is healthy and you eat something else, right? So just kind of, there is an implicit effective function to it. So that's one thing. That's one criterion one can state. Sorry, you were going to say?
No, I was going to say, yeah, maybe, yeah.
So that's the criterion one may state and one might look for in a story like this. Is there any such thing here, such that the cosmic rule or the form rule has any practical implications? It's very hard to see. Okay, well, the second perspective one can take, which is much more open-ended, is that doesn't really matter what the formal rule is. The fact of the matter is you've broken a formal rule, and a human being that breaks rules automatically feels punished for it.
Right.
So that there is a power in the formal rules themselves that can injure somebody spiritually.
Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the case in this regard, no?
Yes, that would be the case in this regard, but this second perspective is also much weaker because it can apply wholesale to any kind of formal rules. It's a much wider criterion. But that also shows maybe just a weird way in which we are put together as human beings, that we can be so injured by formality, by abstract theoretical values, that they as such have a practical value.
I wonder if the strength of a rule then is when it can combine both moments, when its violation has both a practical implication and also is felt spiritually as a violation. So
those would be the best rules, the most robust rules.
Right.
And my guess is that these are the kind of rules that eventually survive because they have this more coherent logic to them, whereas something that is incoherent passes away, does not survive.
Yeah. Maybe instead of incoherence, another word could be something that is more contingent. Will be more open to sort of the passage of time.
Yeah. Well, all of these things will be contingent in a practical sense. But I suppose we need to look at the system of which they form moments to really see whether they are necessarily contingent, I suppose.
Right. Yeah.
So this is the problem, I think, with our approach of India, is that we are looking at it from the outside in. Mm-hmm. But perhaps it is more coherent from the inside, seeing that we see how these behaviors, practices do play an important constitutional role for the system as a whole.
Yeah. Okay. So then Hegel sort of, I think a nice summary of what Hegel thinks about this, what we've just been talking about, is what he writes at the top of the paragraph. In this way, the Hindu lives dependent on external matters. Inner freedom, morality, one's own intellect can find no place here.
Yeah.
Hindus exist in this domination by externality, with the result that they can have no inherent ethical life. Then further down, the Hindu institution rules out all that rests upon one's own free will. Damning stuff here.
It's pretty damning stuff.
Yeah.
It's like when we moved out of China and went into India, we really didn't move very far.
Yeah.
It's like we bounced back to the same kind of problematic that was in China, but it seems like an even worse situation.
Because now it's it's the exuberance of subjectivity and objectivity that is what is externally limiting the individual. It's no longer just brute objectivity that's acting as the hindrance.
Yes, and that, at least in the brute objectivity of ancient China, there was this sense that there is an implicit individual somewhere, namely the emperor. Here, there isn't even that.
No, it's just particularities here.
Yeah, and an explicit subjectivity that is diffused into all sorts of particularities.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have anything else you want to bring up?
Just one very final small point, which I was thinking about as we were reading this.
Yeah.
Which was, when we started off this series, we sort of emphasized that we were interested in looking at the logical development, trying to discern the logical development. And it's difficult to discern the logical development because Hegel spends about 95% of these lectures giving examples, and about 5% where he just throws these sort of Lynchian moments of insight.
Yeah.
And I think everything that we just discussed, all the comments we've made about why we're talking about marriage, testimony, religious practices, property, I had the doubt that these are not part of the logical development proper. Right? We have the logical development sort of in the very beginning, where we understand India as the overextension of subjectivity in objectivity, to put it crudely.
Yeah.
And then once we have that sort of key, that sort of way of reading things, Hegel then sort of takes us through these numerous facets of state organization.
Yeah. And
tries to understand them, or tries to show how they express this sort of key, this key idea.
Yeah.
But they themselves are not part of the logical development of world history. Like, there isn't a movement from the castes to civil legislation, and then from civil legislation to the religious sphere, as we'll discuss next time. It seems to me that the movement is from what we saw as being the general sphere of ancient China into ancient India. And then once we've understood what ancient India is in the broadest possible terms, Hegel then wants to show us how this plays out in these various features of the states. Anyway, this was my thoughts about it. I don't know what you think about this.
Yeah, so one can take one of two approaches. Is either like a full immanent development systematic thing in the likes of science and logic, philosophy of right, etc. Or it's more like the phenomenology of spirit, kind of piecemeal development, where in the phenomenology of spirit, you have shapes of consciousness that are able to make micro developments, but they're not able to make macro developments. So sense certainty is not able to fundamentally change and become perception. It's just that there is a gap there, and that the phenomenologist bridges that gap based on the insight they find in the first shape of consciousness that then sort of leads into, that then is it becomes the starting point of the next one. So maybe there is something similar at work here, where there's a more piecemeal approach that in history, the expressions of the logic are shapes that are set. They just are what they are. But that latent and underlying that is the kind of further development which is at work there. But it's not apparent on face value. It's only apparent once you connect these shapes together.
I see what you mean. Yeah. I would like to think that it's the former, the immanent development, And
we would, well, of course, we would like
we
to
would
think
like
that.
that, yeah.
Yeah.
And all these, and then all these other things, these sort of particular features, are just things that Hegel has already figured out as being important to the state, and he's just highlighting them. But that's an interesting reading, that of the sort of the phenomenological reading of the world history.
Yeah,
But
these
yes,
are just like starting approaches. It may be that if, in fact, when we study this more closely, it's like that maybe there's a third different kind of operation taking place.
something to think about as we continue to progress.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I do want to also raise a tiny point.
Please.
Yes. To end with, so the stuff we've been reading throughout this section is a lot of the stuff is accounts from the British, right, and the kind of experience they had, which makes you think, well, hang on, this isn't really ancient India. This is pretty modern India. Like it's India in the 1700s, 1800s. How so are we thinking of India as just this one block of time that just was ancient for 4,000 years? Is that how we're thinking about this? Or are we just illicitly thinking of ancient India through a lens of more modern India, even though, ancient India would have been slightly different, so that we're having a wrong impression?
Yeah, it's a good point.
Hegel isn't clear about this.
No,
he just takes it for granted, and I think that given this huge span of time, it shouldn't be taken for granted, because when the British are in India, it's not ancient India anymore.
Yeah.
It's India, whatever it is at that time, and more modern.
Well, he refers to the laws of Manu and also to the Mahabharata.
Yeah.
Which I think are older texts.
Yeah.
But you're right that he is conflating, or he is uncritically combining older texts with modern accounts.
Yeah.
And that raises some questions.
Yeah, it would be like, if somebody kind of looks at Europe from an external viewpoint, and then looks at, yes, but these Europeans have Christianity and they have the Old Testament as part of their religious text. And in the Old Testament, there's a bunch of, funky rules about, not eating this or that or behaving so and so. And therefore, the European must abide by these rules, right? Which is, silly. But no, it's like, just because it's in the sacred text long ago from somewhere, it's long been, it's just dead at this point.
Yeah.
And maybe like a lot of the things that Hegel pays attention to here are also dead.
Yeah.
Even though the conflicting reports from the British counteract that, right? Which seem to support that note. These texts still have value and are still lived by today.
Yeah.
Which, if that's the case, that is another fascinating thing to see, because hang on, this shit's been going on for like thousands of years.
Yeah.
That's incredible in and of itself. Just like,
as incredible as what we saw in China, right?
Yeah, but China has developed a lot more since it seems to me that.
I mean, again, I'm no expert, but it strikes me that, there was an emperor in China up until the early 1900s, no?
Yeah.
So I imagine relatively similar.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I suppose the main structure has been relatively stable.
Well, but that's another question, though. We didn't raise this point in our episode on China, but maybe your point, stands there too.
Yeah.
Maybe there is some kind of tension in the sources used between
But
the
just
17th century missionaries and these more ancient texts.
Yeah, there is that, and also the idea of an ancient civilization that's still here.
Yeah.
That is strange to think about, because a lot of the other ancient civilizations, Rome, Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, they're all gone.
Yes.
They only survive as moments or fragments.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Something to think about.
Something to think about, yeah.
Yeah.
Keep our eye on.
Yes. Thanks, people, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that and brought some questions and ideas. And please comment below. Tell us what you think. We'll be sure to discuss it in our next episode.
We will. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.